Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. All right. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. So inshallah, we have a lot to cover today. I would like to welcome all of you back. Jazakallah khair for attending once again. All of you, as I mentioned, are our esteemed guests. So I appreciate all of you and everything that you guys have sacrificed in order to be here and take out time of your special day to attend as well. What I would like to do is just quickly give a shout out to Sister Rhoda. Dr. Rhoda has been here kind of a lot of behind the scenes and really helping us keep the ball rolling. So I just wanted to give her a little shout out and Jazakallah khair for helping with kind of monitoring certain things for us during the seminar. So let's get right into it because there is a lot to cover and I'm sure all of you are anticipating what is going to be presented today, inshallah. So to begin with, these are going to be our topics that we'd like to cover. The fundamental questions that we had mentioned yesterday, these are the fundamental questions that we will be discussing today. First and foremost, what is the origin of humankind? And that's where we will talk about evolution and God's special creation. And then after that section, we will have Q&A, just so that way we can kind of keep all of the discussion together. And then at the end, we will have, we'll talk about Unit 3, which is what is the human's essential nature? And this is where we'll discuss neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and the relationship of those to the soul, inshallah. So then, just before we begin, there is a lot here to tackle. And I want to review just a few things that we discussed last time in terms of epistemology, because we'll be using a lot of that today, right? A lot of that will be relevant to our discussion. And so all of you should have received in the follow-up email from Tuesday's lesson, the 3 documents. So the first and foremost is the spectrum of certainty or truth. And this is where it talks about qat'i versus dhanni. Right? So just a kind of quick review, qat'i is where something is absolutely certain, right? A proposition that we are saying that is absolutely certain regarding its text, right? And there is no other interpretation of that text. There is only one interpretation, and the meaning of that is 100% true, okay? And then dhanni, we mentioned last time, was probabilistic, right? So here, whatever proposition that is being presented, we are not 100% certain that it is true, right? It can have a range of certainty, but we are not 100%, right? Again, we're in the realm of probabilistic. And so this also gives the meaning that whatever text we are looking at, it can have multiple meanings, right? So there can be other meanings than just what is presented or taken as face value. And so the other thing to keep in mind here is with dhanni, there is some level of doubt, okay? The other document that you should have received is the judgment types. So here, the judgment types, there are 3, right? Again, just quick review, so that way we kind of have this in our minds as we go through the lessons for today. First and foremost is revelatory judgment, right? We know revelatory judgment are going to be the statements that are only known from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For example, fasting, right? We know fasting is fard because it is mentioned in the Quran, right? And the source of knowledge for revelatory judgments will be true reports, as discussed last time. The second of the judgment types is rational, right? Rational judgments are statements that we know that do not require any senses to be observed or any revelation, right? This is from your aql. You're going to think about it, and when you think about it, it makes sense, right? And the last of them is going to be empirical judgments, and this is where the statements we know from our 5 senses, right? So the source of knowledge for those will be our 5 senses. There we go. Okay. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that whenever we're looking at scientific judgments, right, all scientific judgments fall under the rational possible judgment type. Okay, so therefore, not only should it make sense that it is true, right? Then on an empirical level, it needs to be true as well, right? That it should make sense. We have five senses to be able to judge that statement. And then it should be in the realm of possible, right? Now, to kind of understand this, we can go back to the question that we had last time about miracles, right, from the first session. So a miracle cannot be defined as something impossible because of the fact that it can happen. So therefore, even miracles would actually fall under the realm of possible, right? We would just say that the evident is not according to the normal association we have, right? Like we talked about last time, the normal association, that what we normally on a regular basis see is that fire burns. But does that mean that fire always has to burn 100% of the time? No. So the fire that didn't burn Ibrahim alayhi salam, that was, we know through revelation, right? So again, this knowledge is qat'i, right? Going back to qat'i versus dhanni. We know that the fire didn't burn Ibrahim alayhi salam. So therefore, this is qat'i, certain, 100% true knowledge that we have. And so we would say that this evident, right, or this event goes against only normative associations, right? So here we would define miracles from a religious perspective is when the common association that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created doesn't happen, right? And this can be with or without any empirical causes. So as Muslims, we would say miracles are possible. Now, we talked about last time, naturalists, right? They would say that miracles are not possible. So here, the definition of impossible is something that is not possible. It can never happen. For example, a squared circle, right? That can never happen because it goes against the very definition of what a square and what a circle is. Does that make sense? Kind of a thumbs up if all of that is pretty clear. Okay. Okay, wonderful. Alhamdulillah. All right. So moving on. Just want to make sure that you guys are able to see my screen. Okay. And then the last document that you guys were sent was this document of the epistemic framework worksheet. So this is a review worksheet that is included in the curriculum as a resource to kind of as a review or a culmination activity for the entire curriculum. Right now, we as the curriculum developers actually have a running debate of where to place this document. So I would like to actually ask you at the end of all of these seminars what you guys think, so that way we can kind of see what your opinions are as well. But this is something that I would like you to, if possible, to print out and kind of have on hand. This is going to be something that would be very helpful if you fill out as we go through the different units. And then that way, if there are questions, we can answer them. But it is something that we will cover collectively on the last day. So next Thursday, we will cover this collectively. And the one thing to how to fill this out is that this first portion where it says evidence for the claim type, this is where we're going to mention the revelatory, rational, and empirical judgments. Right. And then for the level of evidence, this is where we're going to mention whether it's qat'i or dhanni. Okay. All right. So now that we kind of have those things on hand, right? So again, these are things that we need to keep in mind because I will be asking all of you for that feedback, so that way you guys can keep these things in mind, right? Qat'i versus dhanni, as well as revelatory, rational, and empirical evidences. So now, keeping in mind our intention and goals for our students with this curriculum that we went over Tuesday, Muslim students learning about science from a secular perspective may encounter several challenges. And we see that because these challenges stem from when we look at scientific theories and then compare that to religious beliefs, it might not align, right? And so most of the significant conflicts arise when we're learning about evolution in biology class. Right? Students see, particularly when it comes to the origin of human beings, that Islamic teachings and interpretations conflict with the theory of evolution. So this creates that tension, right? That cognitive dissonance for Muslim students who adhere to that creationist belief. So yesterday we saw that the most common topic that most of you were interested in was evolution, right? And probably for this very reason, that it does create that conflict. So the basic concern is that there is so much evidence backing the theory of evolution, right? And it's almost taken as fact. And therefore, how do we now reconcile something that we believe to be fact with our Muslim beliefs, right? That Adam al-Islam was created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the very first human being, right? And he wasn't part of this evolutionary concept. So this is something that even as a Quran teacher, right? So obviously this is something I cover in a biology class as a biology teacher, but even as a Quran teacher, many parents have mentioned to their children, you know what, this is not a question that I can answer, because their children have come to them with these types of questions about evolution when they learn it in school. And most of them have been like, you know what, Sister Aisha, can you answer this for them when they come to class? And I've already told them that you'll be able to answer it, right? Kind of very presumptive, but this is something that parents, right, and maybe us as teachers also feel ill-equipped to answer, right? Or we feel that we might not answer it effectively or sufficiently. So we're worried that this might rock the iman of our children. And so this is something that we really want to get into in detail, inshallah. So with that, what is the origin of humankind? So first and foremost, we see that when we look at evolution, we have to start with the concept of time, right? And the reason time is a major factor, as we all know, is in evolution, these concepts need to take place over immensely long periods of geological time in order for these then possible changes to occur. So we start with the age of the earth, right? So let's look at the Quran and see what the revelatory evidence is for the length of time. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that إن ربكم الله الذي خلق السماوات والأرض في ستة أيام, right? So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning in Surah A'raf, ayah number 54, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. So now the question becomes, what does 6 days mean in this verse, right? And so this leads to another question about how we understand time. So here, there's actually 3 various interpretations that the ulama and the fuqaha have mentioned, right? And the tafsir scholars have mentioned. So first and foremost is that 6 days can be interpreted as what we typically think of, right? Dawn to dusk. What comes to mind, right? Saturday, Sunday, Monday, right? A 24-hour period. The other way we can interpret day in the Quran is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually mentions in the Quran, a single day in your Lord's sight is 1,000 years in yours. In another place in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also mentions in Surah 70, the angels and the supreme angelic spirit ascend to him in a single day that would take 50,000 years to traverse, right? So from these revelatory evidences, we see that day can be interpreted as 1,000 to 50,000 years. Now the question then comes, is that long enough period of time, right? So the third interpretation of day in the Arabic language, it refers to al-awqat, right? So this would refer to time periods. So 6 days in this verse can refer to 6 periods of time, right? And this could be similar to the concept of deep time that evolution is referring to. Now, when and how long ago exactly the creation of Adam and Islam falls into this time spectrum is up for speculation and interpretation, right? This information is all, again, referring to the vocabulary terms, dhanni, right? It is probabilistic in nature, right? There is no certainty of what that time measurement actually is. And actually our Nas, the Quran and the Hadith, don't give a specific time when Adam alayhi salam was created in this, except that it was after the creation of the heavens and the earth, right? So this is the only kind of understanding that we have of when Adam alayhi salam comes into play here, right? And it's mentioned here, as we see, that, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in Surah Sa'ad that and mention when your Lord said to the angels, truly I will create a man, right? A bashar from clay. So here again, we're talking about the creation of Adam alayhi salam as the very first human being, right? And again, it's mentioned, and the people will come to Adam alayhi salam and say, you are the father of mankind, right? Abu al-Bashar. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you with his own hand and breathed into you of his spirit. So here in this hadith, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to Adam alayhi salam, and Adam alayhi salam is known to be Abul Bashar, right? The father of mankind, meaning the original first human being, right? Now, one thing to note that I want to add here is that this is not understood as a anthropomorphic view of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But this signifies that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created Adam alayhi salam personally, right? Himself. So through these revelatory texts and evidence, right, we have established that the origin of man is due to the personal creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So now I'd like to ask you, right, and I'm going to constantly ask you for kind of that feedback, but put in the chat, is this information qat'i or is this information dhanni? So we would say the statement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created Adam alayhi salam as the first human being, is this qat'i or is this dhanni? You guys can type it in the chat so that way I can see it there. Very good. This is qat'i, right? And why is it qat'i? Because this is from the 100% certain knowledge we have from revelation, right? Very good. So that's something to keep in mind. Next, did human beings evolve from prior living beings, right? So did the human form evolve? So again, let's look at our text. Wait, sorry, there you go. Let's look at the text, right? In Surah Infitar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states about himself that he is the one who created you, fashioned you, and perfected your design. And now this is referring to the physical form of the human being, right? This does not indicate that humans were created in any evolutionary manner, right? It's saying from the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created human beings in that perfect form that he designed us in, right? So this negates any type of evolution or kind of development from a prior being. Or starting from a primitive form and then evolving into a more developed form, right? In Surah At-Tin, we see the very same thing, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also mentions here that indeed we created humans in the best form, right? لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, right? أحسن تقويم being the best, the fairest of symmetry form, right? Again, from the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created human beings in this best form. So therefore, we can say that human beings are created from the onset in a complete physical form and the best symmetrical physical form. So then the question the answer to, did human beings evolve from prior living beings? We would say no, humans did not evolve from any other prior human beings, right? Or any prior creation, right? So we wouldn't say just only other species, right? From any prior beings, right? And this is what we know as human exceptionalism, right? That human beings are the exception in the philosophy of evolution, right? Neo-Darwinian evolution, to be specific. And we'll talk about what Neo-Darwinian evolution consists of in just a bit. So first, covering the Islamic narrative of creation, we see that human exceptionalism is the fact that humans are exempted from the philosophy of evolution. Now, we actually on this curriculum, on the curriculum guide page as well, there is a supplemental document that's entitled Human Exceptionalism, explaining human exceptionalism. And there is a lot of explanation there that you can look at that talks about this term, human exceptionalism, right? And it can be different connotations depending on how you look at it, right? There's a theological view of it, there's an epistemological view of it, as well as an evolutionary biological understanding of human exceptionalism, right? So this is something that goes into much more detail, but here I'm giving you just a very brief understanding of what human exceptionalism is. Okay, so now there's a lot of more that we can discuss here, right? There's a lot more evidences that we can look at and make it much more detailed, but just for the brevity of time and to make sure that we get through a lot and I allow more time for questions and answers, I wanted to summarize what is the truth statements of the doctoral position in Islam regarding humans and evolution. Okay, so first and foremost, humans are the most superior and honorable of all creation. And again, we get this from hadith. Number two, the human species is created from turab, from dust, and proliferated from the first human being, Adam alayhi salam. And from Adam alayhi salam, then comes all of humankind, right? He would be the father of all humankind. Number three, Adam alayhi salam was created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah, in paradise, not on earth. So therefore, we also have this understanding that evolution takes place on earth, right? Not in Jannah. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Number four, there were other living beings before humans were created, right? And we know this because again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the heavens and the earth prior to creating Adam alayhi salam. And so there would have been, right, other living beings on this earth prior to the creation and the presentation of human beings on this earth. Number five, humans are created from the outset in a complete physical form, in the fairest symmetrical form, right? As we mentioned, ahsani taqweem. So humans did not evolve over the course of time from another species, right? Humans are living beings, distinct in essence, right, from other living beings. So that's something to keep in mind as well as we get into discussing the evolutionary side of the theory, right? And last but not least, man does not belong to the anthropological classification of Homo, right? And usually we see that, right, in human taxonomy, we're placed under Homo sapiens, right? And this is an assumption being made by evolutionary theorists. And we'll talk a little bit about why we see that in just a bit. And the statements from our revelatory text prove this, right? So connecting back to qat'i dhanni, this means that human taxonomy and the classification that we have in mainstream biology, that we are placed under Homo sapiens, this is a dhanni perspective, right? It's only probabilistic. So, but whereas human exceptionalism, we see this in our nas, in the Quran and Sunnah, that this is qat'i, right? So again, keeping that definition and that understanding in mind. Now let's kind of, after understanding the Islamic narrative of creation, let's look at what science says, right? Let's look at the science of evolution. Now, the science of evolution, even though Charles Darwin is not the first one to come up with the idea of evolutionary process, right? There were actually many other scientists who came up with this idea prior to Charles Darwin. What was unique about Darwin's presentation is that this idea that he came up with a process by which evolution takes place, right? A mechanism to try to explain the diversity of life that he saw on Earth, right? And so what we know from Darwin's famous work, right? He wrote the well-known work, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, right? So the key principles that he outlined, right, using the process of induction, is that he was able to generalize and extrapolate the process of explaining evolution, right? And the key element to highlight to students here would be that it's determined by induction, right? This is very important to notice because induction means is you're going backwards, right? From the information we have today, you're thinking about what it would have been like then, right? So induction is the process of trying to figure out the workings of some phenomenon by studying a sample of it, right? So inductive reasoning or induction is making an inference based on an observation from a sample, right? So that becomes very important to make sure that students understand. Now, the three main principles, right, of evolution from a scientific perspective is number one, deep time, right? And like we just mentioned, that it's needed for that gradualism, right? For it to continue. And then there's common ancestry or descent. And number three is the mechanisms, right? And again, proposed by Charles Darwin, that mechanism is going to be natural selection. Okay, so now let's look at each of those in a little bit more detail. So first and foremost, we have deep time, right? And as we mentioned earlier, a very long period of time is needed for gradual changes to occur, right? And again, I mentioned the word gradualism here, right? Gradualism is that theory that species change slowly and incrementally over time through selection and variation, okay? So the estimate of the Earth now, right, is about 4.6 billion years old, right? And this is much larger or longer than what we originally thought, right? The original thought from scientists is that first they thought a couple million years, right? Or maybe a billion years or so. But now from radiometric dating, right, which is a very robust and sound evidence, is that we understand that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, right? So it has been determined that this is a very well-established technique, right? And the percent error for this radiometric dating is 1%. So let me give you an understanding of and put this in context of what that 1% percent error means. It means that if we're determining the number of years to be 10 million, right? If something is 10 million years old, this could be that it's 9 million years old or up to 11 million years old, right? So that's what that plus or minus one means, is that it could be off by a million. Okay, so that itself should give you some understanding. So looking at this concept of deep time, is this concept of deep time qat'i or dhanni? I'm asking all of you. And if you guys feel comfortable in unmuting, you'd like to answer that, I welcome that as well. All right, I have to check the time to make sure that it's not the same answer from last time. Okay, very good, right? So this is dhanni, right? Because this is a probabilistic knowledge that we have based on radiometric dating, okay? Number two, let's get to common ancestry, right? So again, this is a place where a lot of that confusion happens as well. Now, it's an important distinction to make is between the origin of life versus the origin of species, okay? So abiogenesis is the origin of life, okay? And again, biology teachers would know, right? A meaning absence of, bio meaning life, and then genesis is this beginning of something, right? So this is the origin of life, the beginning of life. But what Charles Darwin spoke of was the origin of species. And this is where evolution is, right? How species evolve into other species, okay? So it's interesting and important to note that Darwin actually never mentioned human beings in his book when talking about the origin of species. He primarily focused on animals and insects, right? So this book is called The Origin of Species, not The Origin of Life, okay? Now, just kind of to have that visual understanding of what this means is that when we're looking at the phylogenetic tree of life, right, this or red dot here at the beginning, this would signify the origins of life. And then the rest of the phylogenetic tree here would be the origins of species, okay? Okay. Next, the last thing, or now, the one thing that I'd like to also mention about this is that until now, there's been no adequate explanation of the origins of life, right? So this abiogenesis, there's no, from a scientific perspective, there's no adequate explanation for the origin of life, right? Evolutionary biologists have methodological disagreements about where these phylogenetic trees branch off, right? So if we're talking about where these are coming off of and at what point do they then branch off into a different species, biologists have a lot of disagreements about that, right? And constantly revising the placement of these species, right, in the light of new evidences, specifically genetics, right? So scientists cannot go back in time and investigate and analyze extinct species, measure accurately where exactly they would be changing and how, right? They can't do these experiments in the lab. So scientists have to use inferences based on current traces and project them into the past, okay? So as a result, what we get from this is that inferences and projections are constantly changing due to new information, right? So we're deciphering it in different ways based on the knowledge that we have gained in recent times, okay? So again, I would ask, so is a common ancestry qat'i or lanni? Absolutely, right? So this would mean that the principle of common ancestry is very lanni in terms of its truth, seen through the constant adjustments and disagreements that scientists are constantly making. So now moving on to the third of the key principles of evolution is mechanisms, right? So there are two very well-known and consistent mechanisms that are presented in the science of evolution. First and foremost is random mutations, right? So random mutations are changes in the nucleotide sequence of DNA that occurs without a pattern, right? This is why we refer to it as random. And it introduces new variations into the population. So these genes are then combined and then mixed, right, on very probabilistic measures. And after this combination and mixing of genes happens, it produces offspring, right? But we cannot absolutely determine which gene came from which parent, right? Because of that combination. So we consider this random only because we have not figured out what that particular mechanism is that determines that information, okay? The next is natural selection. So this is nature's ability to select the ones that are the most capable to survive in that environment, right? And because of this survival, they're able to obviously grow long enough to then reproduce and generally have offspring and then successfully pass on their traits to their offspring, right? And so this is well known. So I won't go into too much of natural selection because again, this is very common and well-known information about the science of evolution. But what I'd like to go into is understanding that these three key principles are what make up and collectively are known as neo-Darwinism. Okay, so it's not just Darwinism, but neo-Darwinism because of the fact that this is the theory of evolution that represents the synthesis, right? The combining of Charles Darwin's theory in terms of natural selection and adds on the modern population genetics that we know today, right? So the key difference to note is that Darwinianism was based on phenotypic differences, right? Phenotypic meaning physical differences that we can see and that are passed down from species to species. But neo-Darwinism has been updated to include genetics to explain these differences on a not a just phenotypic, but a genotypic level, right? The understanding that variant genes are inherited and passed down, right? Not necessarily that we have to see them, right? Like Charles Darwin had proposed, okay? So then obviously that question becomes, is this whole concept of neo-Darwinism or neo-Darwinian evolution qat'i or lanni? So what I'd like to do is not only just, I would like to answer qat'i or lanni, but I would like you to explain why, right? Why is the concept of neo-Darwinism qat'i or why it is lanni? Well, let's start with what we know. Okay, we know, as we mentioned earlier, that fossil records are there, right? Good, right? It's only a theory, but we have to have explanations of why, right? We have to have the details of understanding why is the theory lanni, right? Just being a theory doesn't necessarily make it dhanni, right? So in this case, what we would say is that first and foremost, fossil records, right? That's the biggest proof that evolutionary scientists present. And so we'll look at fossil records are only snapshots, and they're assembled together by researchers based on their own perspectives and interpretations of that raw data, right? That does not necessarily mean that this is how it actually occurred, right? They're educated assumptions, right? And so we see that fossil records are going to be just assumptions, right? Next, we would say evolutionary biologists still are divided over the processes that actually take place, right? And this should be considered very fundamental, and they're still divided on what is actually considered very fundamental, right? So for example, I know the biology teachers would know that homologous parts, right? So if we look at homology, it's only based on seeing similarities, right? Which can be seen through the fact that the source of all of these organisms is the same. And that source is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So it makes sense to see unity in the living beings, even though they might be diverse, okay? The next would be that we have this concept of extended evolutionary synthesis, right? So even evolutionary scientists understand that the neo-Darwinism explanation is not sufficient, right? So this is an umbrella term of a set of contemporary theories that propose modification and extensions to neo-Darwinism, right? It includes ideas related to epigenetics, developmental biology, the niche construction, which can all influence the course of evolution, right? So the reality is that it's an evolving science. Don't mind the pun, but they basically haven't made all of this work yet, right? So this is why they've constantly had extensions to the evolutionary concept that we know today. And there are numerous arguments regarding the exact mechanism of evolution. And if the mechanisms are not certain, then therefore the theory as a whole is not certain, right? So the reality is that we can conclude that neo-Darwinism and its principles are dhanni, they are probabilistic, and they are not certain, right? And again, we won't just say that the theory as a whole is, we would give these specific definitions or these specific points of why we believe it to be dhanni, okay? So then that comes to the point of what can we accept from evolution, right? From this neo-Darwinian understanding. Exactly, very good, right? So because of these scientific inferences, right? Because it is a still developing science, right? So we're constantly making changes. So therefore it can't be qat'i, right? Qat'i is some things that we know definitely for sure. If we're still coming up with evidences and still trying to develop it, obviously it would be dhanni. Very good, mashallah. Okay. So now coming to kind of wrap this up, right? What can we actually accept from evolutionary biology, right? We would need some qat'i knowledge or some qat'i criteria to be able to decide what exactly we can accept from the concept of evolution, right? And only through revelatory judgment, we would be able to come to that clear conclusion, okay? And so what we see is that if we do not find any clear ayat or hadith regarding these topics, we would then need to make sure that at the least, it doesn't go against what is mentioned in the Quran and hadith, okay? And so what we see here is that the concept of insan, right? The concept of insan is not the same concept of Homo sapiens, right? The distinction of humans and animals is very evident, right? And the way that it's evident is that our revelatory sources present a clear difference between what we call haywan versus haywan and natiq, right? Haywan linguistically just means living being, right? A being that has a body, it grows, etc., right? So we would put animals, all right? That's what, in even regular terms, right? Haywan refers to animals. But when we add the concept of an-natiq, right? Literally, which means to articulate or to speak, we're also defining it in a rational term, right? We're saying that these beings are rational beings, ones that are able to articulate and have the ability to articulate rationally, which we would then call the aql, right? And so speaking denotes specifically the ability to name something and have names for something, right? And we see this in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that he taught Adam the name of things, right? So thus a human is a living being that speaks, and the only living being that speaks, right? Again, we're talking about being able to name things and have names for things. This is what distinguishes us from animals, right? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran and Surah Rahman as well, right? خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ عَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانَ, that he created human beings using the word insan here, and then عَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانَ, taught them speech, right? So there's a very distinct factor that separates haywan, animals, and haywan al-natiq, right? Us as human beings. Okay, now there's one more thing that I want to mention, right? And this is more of a kind of nuanced discussion and something that's probably very new, and that something that we haven't been exposed to as of yet. And so here we would say that there's two ways of looking at ancestral trees, right? So in order to make sure that we don't contradict Islamic teachings, there have been two perspectives that have been proposed by Muslim scientists, and namely Dr. Shoaib Malik. And he's the one who actually was one of the scientists that collaborated in designing this unit of evolution and God's special creation. So their two concepts are, first and foremost, there's the concept of human exceptionalism, right? And we mentioned this word before, that this concept generally refers to the belief that humans are fundamentally different from and superior from other animals, right? Owing to this unique quality of having rationalism, morality, language, and a soul. So humans are seen as isolated species, right? So you'll see on this phylogenetic tree, there's a space between pre-sapiens and then the space where Adam alayhi salam came about, okay? So here, this shows that Adam alayhi salam did not extend from the evolutionary tree, right? There is no evolutionary connection here, right? They're an isolated species. We human beings are an isolated species, okay? The other view that is out there that Dr. Shoaib Malik actually has presented is Adamic exceptionalism, right? So Adamic exceptionalism maintains that Adam alayhi salam and Hawa alayhi salam as well as direct divine creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also postulates that their descendant human beings could have inbred with other homonyms that were already present on the earth, right? So these other homonyms who were already present on earth were a result of evolutionary processes, and the human beings after Adam alayhi salam, right, they interbred with these homonyms, okay? So here you'll see on this phylogenetic tree, there are a couple of prepositioned possible positions where Adam alayhi salam could have appeared, right? Again, we mentioned that the Nas does not mention exactly where Adam alayhi salam had appeared and on the kind of trajectory of time, right? So this can be possible because of the fact that revelatory text doesn't mention a timeline, right? And so here we're proposing these are a few options where Adam alayhi salam could have come about, right? And again, our Nas also doesn't have any specific clear-cut objections to this concept of interbreeding, right? And as I said, revelatory text is silent on this. So we could say that this is true or could have happened, but also could not have happened, right? There is no qat'i way for us to know for sure, right? But this is an opinion that doesn't go against Islamic belief, but also it aligns with evolutionary thought as well. Okay. Now, again, like I mentioned, right, you can use that supplemental material, which is called Comprehending Human Exceptionalism, for more details. And then there's also linked is Dr. Shoaib Malik's video that explains this a little bit more detail. But I just wanted to make you guys aware that these two ideas are there in the Islamic realm, right? Or the realm of Muslim scientists. And again, in the end, we would say Allahu Alam, right? Allah knows best exactly what and how it happened. But these are ways of reconciling with the concept of evolution and all of the proofs that are mentioned within it. Okay. Now, I'll end with this before we get to question and answer, right? One key note for students who are still perplexed about this idea is to have patience, right? Like all of you have mentioned also in understanding whether neo-Darwinism is qat'i or dhanni, there's a lot of information that is still coming out, right? And so what we would say is that we should be comfortable and teach our students to be patient with the idea that we don't have all the answers. And we don't have to have all the answers immediately either, right? So this should be a general principle of how scientific projects work anyway, right? It takes time to research, get the data, test the data, compare that data, right? So now that we've established that the concept of evolution is dhanni, if one is to feel kind of still have this kind of distraught feeling and want to have some level of certainty, the only resort that they have for qad'i knowledge is what is mentioned authentically in Quran and Hadith, right? And so this reminds me of something that my mom used to always say, right? Alhamdulillah, I'm a family of 6, right? So I have 5 other brothers and sisters. And so my mom would mention that when each of us was born, right? When my elder brother was born, that the doctor had mentioned, make sure you put the baby on the back to sleep, right? And then when I was born, the doctor mentioned, no, we've discovered that we should put our babies on their stomachs to sleep, right? Again, when my sister was born, flipped it, right? That, oh, it should be at the back. Then when my sister was born again, no, it should be the stomach, right? And so obviously now we've determined that SIDS, right, sudden infant death syndrome is a thing, right? Now, if a person was to follow the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right, the sunnah is to put babies to sleep on their backs or on their sides, right? Never their stomach. So this is something, again, if we were to resort back to our qad'i knowledge, then it makes it easier for students to say, okay, at least I know something for certain, and all of the rest of it is dhanni. Okay. So I know that was a lot to absorb, and hopefully, inshallah, I've presented it as clear as possible. May Allah give me the tawfiq to continue to present it in an appropriate manner, but I will leave it there for any questions, inshallah, regarding evolution. And again, if you'd like to unmute, you're more than welcome to unmute and ask your questions. Absolutely, Javeria, right? It's important to embark that our students have this kind of level of patience, right? And again, when we see how the scientific method works, right, we see that, right? We see that it takes time to discover, to get data, to test that data and all of that. And so students should be reminded of that constantly, just so that way they see that this is, again, don't mind the pun, but an evolving science, right? It's constantly changing and updating. Very good. So any questions on that before I move forward? Because we do have another whole unit to cover. But I didn't want to take anything out of this unit because of the fact that I know everyone was very keen on trying to learn about evolution. And so I tried to summarize it as best as I could without taking out kind of key principles that we needed to mention. Alhamdulillah. Okay. So if there are no questions regarding that, and again, if questions do come up, alhamdulillah, we have 2 more sessions, right? Feel free to jot those down as you're thinking about and processing it until next Tuesday. So that way we can address those questions later on as well, inshallah. You are all very welcome, alhamdulillah. Okay. So now moving on to our second unit of the day. What is the human's essential nature, right? We will be covering neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and the soul. And so in this discussion, we're going to refer to these 3 kind of understandings or views that we have of how we look at the essential nature of human being, right? And in order to answer this fundamental question, we'll be explaining the relationship between these three, right? The neuroscience view, the artificial intelligence and what we understand from it, and obviously the Islamic perspective of the soul. And so really we'll be discussing what does it mean to be human, right? How human is defined and characterized differently in Islamic theology versus how it's defined in science and in the new realm of artificial intelligence is going to give us an understanding of what that term human means, okay? Now, before I begin, what do you all think human is referring to, right? When we say the essence of a human, what are we talking about? Any thoughts or ideas? Again, trying to make this interactive as much as possible so that way I can see your feedback and make sure you guys are awake. I know maybe my voice is not as energetic to keep everybody awake. Any ideas of what does it mean to be human? Okay, so a human has the ability to decide right and wrong. Okay, any other ideas? That would take us further of what is right and wrong then, right? Okay, so what does it mean to be human, right? Along that actually comes, there we go, okay, right? It contains the soul, perhaps, right? Humans are allowed to make certain decisions, right? We have the ability to make decisions, right? Again, connecting to that deciding between right and wrong, right? So really what this leads to is the default question of what's the purpose of life, right? If we can answer what's the purpose of life, then we can perhaps understand what does it mean to be human, right? Now, looking at these 3 points, right, of Islam and the view of neuroscientists and then the view of artificial intelligence, we would say that we would answer this question of what does it mean to be human with, as Brother Yahya mentioned, right, is in Islam, we would say to have a soul, right? And when we say that then the follow-up question of what does it mean to be human would be what is the purpose of life? We would say to develop that soul, right? That ruh that we have, but then we also have a nafs, right? And so this is where we understand that we have to develop that soul, right? Now, what I wanted to mention also was that from the perspective of Islam and this field of neuroscientists, and then also again how we look at it from an artificial intelligence perspective, let's examine that concept and kind of highlight the potential conflicts that will exist, right, in this field. Because then now when we look at neuroscientists, when they answer the question what does it mean to be human, they would say to have a brain, right, to have just a physical body, right, because again obviously the brain can't exist without a body, right? It's a very physical understanding, right? And then when we ask the question to neuroscientists about what is the purpose of life, they would not be able to derive a purpose of life because you're merely deducing the existence of a human being to just their body, okay? And then in terms of artificial intelligence, what does it mean to be a human? Means to act like a human, right? To assimilate or mimic the behaviors of a human being, right? And then when we ask the question to follow up, what is the purpose of life? Well, there's no real purpose if AI is only there to mimic human behavior, right? It's only mimicking what human beings actually do, okay? So now let's first start with this Islamic concept of the soul, right? Thinking about what we believe in Islam about our soul, right? And when and how does it exist? Even before our bodies, there was our souls, right? And so we say that even after death, our soul will continue to exist. And so technically, we could even say that we survive death, right? We continue and move on. So our journey as human beings is not tied exclusively to our bodies, right? Our journey does not end at death. There's an afterlife. And so personal identity is related to the soul, right? An identity that exists beyond this world, that carries us through into the next world, right? And so therefore it's not limited to a bodily identity either. Okay, so this is where we get the understanding of me or I, right? In order to talk about myself and my identity individually, right, there needs to be a me that exists, right? There's a mental state of existence for myself, right? And then we will continue to exist as human beings in the afterlife, right? The difference would be that in the afterlife, we are technically, for a short period of time, a soul without a body. Okay, so here we understand these are the 4 stages that that Islam teaches us that our souls go through, right? So first and foremost, there's the alam al-arwah, right? The realm of the souls, right? We were souls without bodies, right? And we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in the Quran, that remember when your Lord took out from the loins of the children of Adam their offspring and said, am I not your Lord, right? And we responded, Bala, right? Of course, yes, indeed, we testify that you are our Lord. And this was in the realm of the souls before we had bodies. And then in this life, our souls were breathed into our bodies and therefore attached to the body that we are known to, right? And so obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this, this is mentioned in a hadith where the Prophet mentions that an angel is sent to it and it breathes the soul into it, right? And we mentioned this earlier as well. And it is commanded to write down 4 things, okay? And inshallah, if we'll talk a little bit about this later as well. And then, so this is where this is the life that we know, right? That we are aware of, that scientists can look at, is our souls were breathed into our bodies, right? And we're in existence where our soul is connected to our bodies. Then the 3rd level, right, is in the grave, right? Here, our souls will be separated from our bodies and our bodies will decay, but our souls will move on, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously mentions this in the Quran, right? Kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut, right? That every soul shall experience death. And here it says that every soul shall experience death, and in many other translations, right, you say it can taste death. So this shows that death is not the end, but it's a step in this continued process, because then the next step is the afterlife, right? Our souls will be reunited with our resurrected bodies. And again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this clearly in the Quran, that then it will be blown, meaning the sur, right? And we will suddenly stand up, right? Again, so that we were resurrected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. So here, what we see is that how do we know that we have a soul, right? Now that we've looked at this Islamic perspective and revelatory evidence for it, let's look at the rational evidence for the existence of the soul, right? We know that we have a soul through introspection, right? Introspection means to look inside of yourself or within yourself, which is in contrast to the empirical view of scientists, right? So empirical view means to look outside of oneself, and introspection means to look within yourself, okay? So that means that we look inside ourselves and we see that we have experiences. We experience cognition, pain, pleasure, happiness, sadness, humility, arrogance, gratitude, and even ingratitude at certain times, right? And so this is something other than or beyond our bodies. Now, we aren't exactly sure what the soul is, but we know it's there, right? We don't know where it is, but we know it's there, right? So this is the rational evidence that we have that tells us that we do indeed have a soul. And again, rational evidence, meaning that you don't need empirical thought, and we don't need, empirical evidences, and we don't also need any specific text, right? Or even revelatory text to tell us that it exists. We can just think about it and realize, yeah, we have to have a soul, right? In examining the revelatory and rational evidence, it seems clear that this should be an accepted view, right? That human beings have a soul. But that's not the case. There are actually challenges to this Islamic paradigm of what it means to be human and whether we even have a soul or not. So what are those challenges, right? The basic challenges or opposing premises are that we are nothing but our brains, right? Like we mentioned that neuroscientists believe our existence is nothing but a physical existence, right? And so we see here that they say that souls don't exist because we can't measure it, right? And then also the opposing view is that consciousness is just an illusion, right? It's just a feeling that we have, but there's no reality to it, right? And the last opposing view that is presented is that human life really has no purpose, right? It's just an existence. Now, before we go further, let's define ontology, right? Ontology is actually the study of existence, right? It deals with the nature of being or the natural world, okay? So now if we compare and contrast the Islamic ontological view versus the neuroscience ontological view, which we call neuroscientific reductionism, okay? Now, neuroscientific reductionism is also known as scientism, right? And let's kind of look at what their view is the world is reduced to only physical objects and only what can be measured, right? So if something has mass, volume, length, shape, velocity, etc., right? This is the only thing that actually can be considered to exist, right? Everything else, it just doesn't exist. And their explanation is that because we can't measure it, right? So if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. And the issue with this view is that it's an incomplete view of the world, right? There's a lot that must be ignored to adopt this view, right? There's so much that's left unexplained. It doesn't explain the varied human experiences that we have, like I mentioned, pleasure, satisfaction, gratitude, right? It also removes meaning and purpose from this world, right? There's no higher purpose, right? As Brother Robert mentioned, right? The purpose of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Since there's no afterlife, right? They're denying any metaphysical existence, right? So then the question then arises, why are we even alive or exist in this world, right? What's the purpose of our existence then? So then we look at how can a worldview that ignores the fundamental part of a human being, which is the soul, which every human being intrinsically understands and experiences its existence, be comprehensive or be taken as a baseline of truth, right? Now, I'm going to kind of quickly move beyond some of these things, but let's see here. This is something that I want to get to. Let's see. Okay, so let's see here. This one. Okay, so the scary part of this understanding of neuroscientific reductionism is that we as Muslims and Muslim teachers specifically have to understand that this neuroscientific view of consciousness is actually becoming very mainstream, right? It's not something that, oh, it seems like so far off, right? Rationally doesn't make sense, Islamically it doesn't make sense. But in society today, as well as among scientists, this has become very mainstream, right? And so when neuroscientific reductionism is talking about consciousness, they're just saying, I'm just a brain, right? So everything that happens to me or I experience is just neurological functioning, right? It's a neurocentric view of the world. And so this idea that we are our brains is, this Dr. Moheb Kastandi, he mentions that this is firmly established now within the scientific realm. And so all of this shows that neuroscientists believe that consciousness is just a brain function, which occurs due to neurological interactions, right? Now, what's the problem with this, right? And obviously, as Muslims, we will see this, it makes sense. But what's the problem with neuroscientific reductionist view of consciousness being just neurological activity? I'm proposing that question to you guys. What do you think is the problem with this view? So here we would say, if everything is reduced to just a physical state, right? Neurons firing, there's no room for the soul, right? It's just a philosophy. So no soul means no purpose in life. And the purpose of human existence is now being ignored, right? And so consciousness would then be just alertness, right? It's just a person who is alive, and it doesn't refer to moral consciousness, right? So why is there an experience associated to a physical state? Well, neuroscientists would say, well, physical states often produce experiences of emotion, right? So for example, when a person has their heart is beating fast, right? It may be due to a feeling of excitement or nervousness. Again, can be tracked in the brain. And the experience of emotions can also affect physical states, right? Now, the hard problem of consciousness, right, as this is mentioned, is that it's the problem of accounting in these physical terms, right? Subjective, intrinsic, first person experiences, right? So this physicalism can explain the mechanics of how our brain works, but it doesn't explain the why, right? It doesn't explain why is it that this is happening. Okay, so the physicalism of neuroscientific reductionism doesn't account for these unique personal and subjective existence. Okay, so this is the problem with neuroscientific reductionism. Now, just for brevity of time, we've covered all of this that we know as Muslims. Our unobservable soul is present because of introspection as well as revelation, right? Obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us in the Quran and discusses the ruh and discusses a little bit about that. And as we saw, that we have these stages that our soul continues on into. So what I would like to get into is now artificial intelligence, right? In artificial intelligence, the question here, when we're talking about what does it mean to be human, right, can also extend into today's society with technological advancements, right? And this leads us to robots and artificial intelligence, right? Can robots really replace us as human beings, right? So if they can do the same things as human beings can do, then can we be replaced? Well, that depends on how human they are and how we define human beings, right? So we saw this in the discussion earlier, and that the discussion is really about consciousness and having a purpose in life. So applying what we've learned just now about what it means to be human and have consciousness, let's now discuss artificial intelligence to see if it resolves these issues, right? And can be determined or defined as human or not. So again, that helps us determine if it's truly can replace us as humans or not, right? So if we look at what artificial intelligence actually is, we would say artificial intelligence, in simple terms, is the ability to perform a task, right? So it is in the science of making machines think like humans, right? So AI technology can process large amounts of data in different ways that human beings cannot process, right? Hence the intelligent part, right? And the goal of AI is to be able to do things such as it recognize patterns, make decisions or judgments similar to the way that human beings do, right? And there are various types of AI, right? There's weak AI, strong AI, generative AI, like we've all heard of ChatGPT, which is a generative AI. But I won't go into the details of that here. Again, you will find those details in the lessons themselves. But what I want to look at is that broad perspective, right? What's the difference between intelligence and consciousness? So the difference here would be intelligence is the ability to do something, right? Ability to do these things, like I said, ability to perform a task. Consciousness is the ability to experience those things. Okay. Now, this is where we get to the Chinese room experiment, right? Now, in this, I wanted to see if we can, considering that we've only got 5 more minutes left, what I would do is I would like to present this video. Perfect, right? Yes, it takes away morality, takes away purpose, accountability, all of that, exactly. Now, let's see if I can play it directly from here.
Sell online and grow your Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace.
So
Squarespace, share your
I'd
passion.
like to do is,
Okay, guys,
let's
real
start
talk. I'm
from
kinda worried. I think
here.
Brother John might be a robot. I know it sounds ridiculous.
So this is going to explain a little bit of what the Chinese room experiment is. And this will give us a clear understanding of what the thought process is of artificial intelligence and kind of look at how AI has this structure of mimicking human behavior, okay?
Room designed to show that passing
No, we can't hear Aisha. If I think maybe your own thing is muted.
I have no idea what
You guys aren't able to hear? Okay, hold on.
Now we are.
Oh, you are? Okay, so I had muted myself, but
Yeah, if you
it
mute
seems like when I'm
yourself,
unmuted, you're able to hear. Okay,
right, exactly.
perfect. Sorry about that. So let me go back just a little bit.
John Searle constructed a famous thought experiment called the Chinese Room, designed to show that passing for human isn't sufficient to qualify for strong AI. Imagine you're a person who speaks no Chinese. You're locked in a room with boxes filled with Chinese characters and a code book in English with instructions about what characters to use in response to what input. Native Chinese speakers pass written messages in Chinese into the room. Using the code book, you figure out how to respond to the characters you receive, and you pass out the appropriate characters in return. You have no idea what any of it means, but you successfully follow the code. You do this so well, in fact, that the native Chinese speakers believe you know Chinese. You've passed the Chinese speaking Turing test, but do you know Chinese? Of course not. You just know how to manipulate symbols with no understanding of what they mean in a way that fools people into thinking you know something you don't. Likewise, according to Searle, the fact that a machine can fool someone into thinking it's a person doesn't mean it has strong AI. Searle argues that strong AI would require the machine have actual understanding, which he thinks is impossible for a computer to ever achieve. Thanks, Thought Bubble. One more point before we get out of here. Some people have responded to the Chinese room thought experiment by saying, sure, you don't know Chinese, but no particular region of your brain knows English either. The whole system that is your brain knows English. Likewise, the whole system that is the Chinese room, you, the code book, the symbols, together know Chinese, even though the particular piece of the system that is you does not. So I've been thinking about it. I'm still not convinced.
Okay. So looking at, let me see if I can go back to my slides. So looking at this Chinese room thought experiment, what are your thoughts? How does this help to explain whether we can understand AI as being human or similar to humans?
Aisha, your slides aren't showing.
There we go. Okay.
Good,
So
thank you.
can AI pass as human? Right? So this is where we get to that concept of syntax versus semantics, right? Syntax is just the structure of language, where semantics is the meaning of the individual words, right? And so think about when people just go to the thesaurus and they just replace the words, right? Because, oh, this sounds a little bit better, but the meaning is not essentially there in the correct context, right? So this goes to then just understanding that can AI then pass as human? We would say, or I would ask all of you, what do you guys think? No, right? And what is the part that's missing that it can't pass as AI or pass as human? Right? It's the soul, right? The soul is what's missing there, right? So what does it mean to be human? When we're answering that question, what is the purpose? Islam is the only comprehensive worldview that gives us that understanding, right? That we can understand everything fully by having this understanding that Islam gives you that full purpose of life. It gives you a connection to that soul that we know through revelatory evidence as well as rational evidence, right? And neuroscience reductionism is only limited to physical existences. And then AI, again, is only there to mimic human behavior, but not to actually absorb true human behavior, right? That unobservable, observable soul is going to be missing there because of the fact that AI can't retrospect, right? It can't have these feelings that are associated to human existence, okay? And then, inshallah, next time we will kind of recap some of this, because I know towards the end, I went through a lot of this very quickly, but I wanted to open it up to all of you for any questions that you guys have. I know our time is up, so I don't want to take too much more time on my part, but if you are guys willing to stay for a couple of question and answers, then I appreciate that. Yeah, very true, right? AI is made off of cognitive connections, right? So, or sorry, on algorithms, not cognitive connections, right? So it's just a programmed method of behavior, right? It's not necessarily like we discussed earlier, like you guys were saying about consciousness, right? Having that ability to decide and make choice, right? And inshallah, actually, that's what we will cover next time, is that we will talk a little bit about determinism, right? So this ability to make choice and what choices can we and can we not make, inshallah, will be covered next time. So any questions regarding neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and the soul? The one thing that I would like to connect this to is one of the questions, right? So I'm going to try to see if I can touch on all of the interesting topics that everyone had mentioned last time. So I noticed that two of you had mentioned gender transitioning, right? Or even sex differentiation during embryonic development. And so the reason why this actually is where you would probably discuss this with students if it is something that is to be discussed in the classroom, is that this is where you would see that this is where they get that idea from, right? Is because someone who is looking at gender fluidity and transitioning and all of that discussion, it's because of the fact that neuroscientific view of the human allows for this concept, right? Because we're just a body. So it shouldn't matter if that body is changed or affected and put the way that you would like, because it's just a bodily existence, right? And so as long as you're functioning neurologically, right, your brain is intact, they would say that this allows for that, right? And allows you to leave the soul out of that, right? And then obviously we don't have to think about the purpose of life, right? Like we said, neuroscientific reductionism reduces it to just a physical existence. There is no purpose, there's no afterlife, right? And this is what allows that kind of thinking to occur, right? And like I said, this is why it's a little bit scary, because this is very mainstream thought nowadays. Okay, so if a student asks how the soul can be confirmed or to exist, we will talk about introspection. Correct, right? So now, when we think about, we would talk about introspection, about the confirmation of the soul existing, but there's also what we call, which I didn't get into, but if we're interested, inshallah, we can talk a little bit more about this next time, is, here we go, is this concept of Ibn Sina's floating man experiment. I remember Brother Yahya was actually in the library and had a book on Ibn Sina, if I remember correctly. So very connective here. But Ibn Sina's floating man experiment, what he says is that a human being, if they are, for example, in this existence where nothing else is there, right? That there is no sensory experiences, there's no connection to the external world. Would a human being still exist, right? Now, this person has no sight, no touch, no smell, no sensory inputs at all. And they are isolated from the external world, right? So Ibn Sina actually argues that even in a state of sensory deprivation, right, in mental isolation, this person would still be aware of their own existence, right? So this ability to even doubt shows that I exist, right? There's Rene Descartes' famous saying that I think, therefore I am, right? So regardless of the existence or non-existence of anything else, one knows for sure at least they exist. Why? Because they're aware of themselves existing. Does that make sense? Right. So he concluded that the very thinking of the self, right, which is in essence the soul, right, it's an immaterial and it possesses this innate knowledge of its own existence. So that's another added on of introspection that you can mention. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So again, not to take too much more time, but inshallah, I will have the ISLA team share the survey for today. Alhamdulillah, already got feedback. Alhamdulillah, I hope that all of you have learned something as well. But just a little bit feedback. I know we went above time, and that was something I was worried about because of so much content that we had to cover. But inshallah, I will revisit a little bit of that the end of this session next time, which will actually lead us into the next discussion for Tuesday's talk and Tuesday's PD presentation, which will be to answer the question of what is the human's future, right? So again, looking forward, and that we will discuss human enhancement and transhumanism. And then to answer the fundamental question about are human actions predetermined, we will have discussions on faith and genetic determinism, inshallah. So looking forward to seeing all of you guys on Thursday, same time, same place, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala barakah in our time and efforts and guide all of us to be excellent educators for the future of our ummah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us as well. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Thank you so much for today's session. I just had one question, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Last, in our previous session, you shared the website that this curriculum is offered on.
Yes.
And I did try to put in my information, the email, name, school name. It gave me an error, though, when I tried to view the curriculum. And I wondered if there was something that I was missing. Does it require payment?
There should be no payment because alhamdulillah, this is a free sourced material that you should all have access to. So let me take you there and see.
Because when I submitted the information, all it gave me was like an error in red below.
Huh. Okay.